formula to it. A very simple formula.
Hello everybody, what's going on? Welcome back to another episode of the Slash It Podcast. Yes, this is the Slash It Podcast. My name is Jared, and yes, this is the Slash It Podcast. This is going to be a different podcast than you're used to, because I don't normally do it like this. Not normally the way that I'm doing it now. But before we get started, if you want to follow me on my socials, if you aren't already, it is at Slash It Horror, Instagram, Twitter, anything like that. It is at Slash It Horror. I also have a Discord. I don't talk about my Discord very often. There's nobody in it right now. But if you want to join and we can have some discussions, maybe some movie nights, those kinds of things, please do let me know. And so yes, this is a very different kind of podcast episode. If you were listening to it, if you just listening to it and don't know the title of the video, title of the podcast episode, actually, I will be listening to, reading is the word that I'm looking for. I will be reading classic horror stories, ones that you've heard 1,000 times. And so before we get started, I wanted to tell you that I am going to be mispronouncing some of these words, because all of these words are very classic. These are from the 1800s. These words I just don't know, or I've never spoken before. So there will be massive mispronunciations of words. None of them are like intentional or anything like that. I'm bad at words. I'll try my best to pronounce them the way that they are meant to be. But I won't be able to pronounce every word the way that they are. So this podcast will be different. I'm going to put some kind of, creepy music underneath where I'm talking, just to kind of give it the audiobook feel. So yeah, that's pretty much all that I have. I will be back to you talking to you like this. After I read all of what I have, the stories that I have. But yeah, thank you very much for listening to my podcast, and here we go. True. Nervous. Very, very dreadfully nervous. I had been and am. But while you say that I am mad, the disease had sharpened my senses, not destroyed, not dulled them. Above all was the sense of hearing acute. I heard all things in the heaven and in the earth. I heard many things in hell. How, then, am I mad? Hearken, and observe how healthily, how calmly I can tell you the whole story. It is impossible to say how first the idea entered my brain, but once conceived, it haunted me day and night. Object there was none, passion there was none. I loved the old man. He had never wronged me. He had never given me insult. For his gold I had no desire. I think it was his eye. Yes, it was this. One of his eyes resembled that of a vulture. A pale blue eye with a film over it. Whenever it fell upon me, my blood ran cold. And so by degrees, very gradually, I made up my mind to take the life of the old man, and thus rid myself of the eye forever. Now this is the point you fancy me mad. Madmen know nothing, but you should have seen me. You should have seen how wisely I proceeded. With what caution, with what foresight, with what dissimulation I went to work. I was never kinder to the old man than during the whole week before I killed him. And every night about midnight I turned the latch of his door and opened it. Oh, so gently. And then, when I had made an opening sufficient for my head, I put in a dark lantern all closed, so that no light shone out. And then I thrust in my head. Oh, you would have laughed to see how cunningly I thrust it in. I moved it slowly, very, very slowly, so that I might not disturb the old man's sleep. It took me an hour to place my whole head within the opening so far that I could see him as he lay upon his bed. Ha! Would a madman have been so wise as this? And then, when my head was well in the room, I undid the lantern cautiously. Oh, so cautiously, for the hinges creaked. I undid it just so much that a single thin ray fell upon the vulture eye. And this I did for 7 long nights, every night, just at midnight. But I found the eye always closed, and so it was impossible to do the work, for it was not the old man who vexed me, but his evil eye. And every morning when the day broke, I went boldly into the chamber and spoke courageously to him, calling him by name in a hearty tone, and inquiring how he had passed the night. So you see, he would have been a very profound old man indeed to suspect that every night, just at 12, I looked in upon him while he slept. Upon the 8th night, I was more than usually cautious in opening the door. A watch's minute hand moves more quickly than did mine. Never before that night had I felt the extent of my own powers. I could scarcely contain my feelings of triumph. To think that there I was, opening the door, little by little, and he had not even to dream of my secret deeds or thoughts. I fairly chuckled at the idea, and perhaps he had heard me, for he moved in the bed suddenly, and as if startled. Now you may think that I drew back, but no, his room was as black as pitch with the thick darkness, for the shutters were close fastened through fear of robbers, and so I knew that he could not see the opening of the door, and I kept pushing it on, steadily. I had my head in, and was about to open the lantern, when my thumb slipped upon the tin fastening, and the old man sprang up on the bed, crying out, "Who's there?" I kept quite still and said nothing. For a whole hour I did not move a muscle, and in the meantime I did not hear him lie down. He was still sitting up in the bed listening, just as I had done, night after night, hearkening to the death watches on the wall. Presently I heard a slight groan, and I knew it was the groan of mortal terror. It was not a groan of pain or grief. Oh no, it was a low, stifled sound that arises from the bottom of the soul when overcharged with awe. I knew the sound well. Many a night, just at midnight, when all the world slept, it has welled up upon from my own bosom, deepening with its dreadful echo. The terrors that distracted me, I say I knew it well. I knew what the old man felt, and pitied him although I chuckled at heart. I knew that he had been lying awake ever since the first slight noise. When he had turned in the bed, his fears had been ever since growing upon him. He had been trying to fancy them causeless, but could not. He had been saying to himself, "It is nothing but the wind in the chimney. It is only a mouse crossing the floor. Or it is merely a cricket which has made a single chirp." Yes, he has been trying to comfort himself with these suspicions. But he had found all in vain, because death, in approaching him, had stalked with his black shadow before him, and enveloped the victim. And it was the mournful influence of the unperceived shadow that caused him to feel, although he never saw nor heard, to feel the presence of my head within the room. When I had waited a long time, very patiently, without hearing him lie down, I resolved to open a very, very little crevice in the lantern. So I opened it. You cannot imagine how stealthily until at length a single dim ray, like the thread of the spider, shot from out the crevice and fell upon the vulture eye. It was open, wide open, and I grew furious as I gazed upon it. I saw it with perfect distinctness, all a dull blue, with a hideous veil over it that chilled the very marrow in my bones. But I could see nothing else of the old man's face or person, for I had directed the ray as if by instinct, precisely upon the damned spot. And now I have not told you that what you mistake for madness is but over acuteness of the senses. Now I say that there came to my ears a low, dull, quick sound, such as a watch makes when enveloped in cotton. I knew that sound well, too. It was the beating of the old man's heart. It increased my fury, as the beating of a drum stimulates the soldier into courage. But even yet I refrained, and kept still. I scarcely breathed. I held the lantern motionless. I tried how steadily I could maintain the ray upon my eye. Meantime, the hellish tattoo of the heart increased. It grew quicker and louder every instant. The old man's terror must have been extreme. It grew louder, I say, louder every moment. Do you mark me well? I have told you that I am nervous. So I am. And now, at the dead hour of the night, amid this dreadful silence of that old house, so strange a noise as this excited me to uncontrollable terror. Yet for some minutes longer I refrained and stood still, but the beating grew louder. I thought the heart must burst, and now a new anxiety seized me. The sound would be heard by a neighbor. The old man's hour had come. With a loud yell, I threw upon the lantern and leaped into the room. He shrieked once only. In an instant I dropped him to the floor and pulled the heavy bed over him. I then smiled to find the deed so far done, For many minutes the heart beat on with a muffled sound. This, however, did not vex me. It would not be heard through the wall. At length it ceased. The old man was dead. I removed the bed and examined the corpse. Yes, he was stone dead. I placed my hand upon the heart and held it there many minutes. There was no pulsation. He was stone dead. His eye would trouble me no more. If you still think me mad, you will think so no longer when I describe the wise precautions I took for the concealment of the body. The night waned, and I worked hastily, but in silence. First of all, I dismembered the corpse. I cut off the head and the arms and the legs. I then took up 3 planks from the flooring of the chamber, and deposited all between the scantlings. I then replaced the board so cleverly, so cunningly, that no human eye, not even his, could have detected anything wrong. There was nothing to wash out, no stain of any kind, no blood spot whatever. I had been too wary for that. A tub had caught all. When I made an end of these labors, it was 4 o'clock. Still dark as midnight. As the bell sounded the hour, there came a knocking at the street door. I went down to open it with a light heart, for what had I now to fear? There entered 3 men, who introduced themselves as officers of the police. A shriek had been heard by a neighbor during the night. Suspicion of foul play had been aroused, and they had been told to search the premises. I smiled, for what had I to fear? I bade the gentleman welcome. The shriek, I said, was my own in a dream. The old man I mentioned was absent in the country. I took my visitor all over the house. I bade them search well. I led them at length to his chamber. I showed them his treasures secure, undisturbed. In the enthusiasm of my confidence, I brought chairs into the room, and desired them here to rest from their fatigues, while I myself, in the wild audacity of my perfect triumph, placed my own seat upon the very spot beneath which reposed the corpse of the victim. The officers were satisfied. My manner had convinced them that I was singularly at ease. They sat, and while I answered cheerily, they chatted of familiar things. But long, I felt myself getting pale and wished them gone. My head ached, and I fancied a ringing in my ears. But still, they sat and still chatted. The ringing became more distinct. It continued and became more distinct. I talked more freely to get rid of the feeling, but it continued and gained definitiveness, until at length I found that the noise was not within my ears. No doubt I grew very pale. But I talked more fluently and with a heightened voice, yet the sound increased. For what could I do? It was a low, dull, quick sound, much such a sound as a watch makes when enveloped in cotton. I gasped for breath, and the officers heard it not. I talked more quickly, but the noise steadily increased. I arose and argued about trifles in a high key. The noise steadily increased. Why would they not be gone? I paced the floor to and fro with heavy strides, as if excited to fury by the observations of the men. But the noise steadily increased. Oh God, what could I do? I foamed, I raved, I swore. I swung the chair upon which I had been sitting, and grated upon the boards, but the noise arose over all, and continually increased. It grew louder, louder, and still the men chatted pleasantly, and smiled. Was it possible they heard not? Almighty God, no, they heard, they suspected, they knew, they were making a mockery of my horror. This I thought, and this I think, but anything was better than this agony. Anything was more tolerable than this. I could bear those hypocritical smiles no longer. I felt that I must scream or die, and now, again, hark, louder. Villains! I shrieked. Dissemble no more. I admit the deed. Tear up the blanks. Here, it is the beating of his hideous heart. The 1,000 injuries of Fortunato I had borne as best I could, but when he ventured upon insult I vowed revenge. You, who so well knew the nature of my soul, will not suppose, however, that I gave utterance to a threat. At length I would be avenged. This was a point definitively settled. The very definitiveness with which it was resolved precluded the idea of risk. I must not only punish, but punish with impunity. A wrong is unredressed when the retribution overtakes its redresser. It is equally unredressed when the avenger fails to make himself felt as such to him who has done the wrong. It must be understood that neither by word nor deed had I given Fortunato cause to doubt my goodwill. I had continued, as was my wont, to smile in his face, and he did not perceive that my smile now was at the thought of his immolation. He had a weak point, this Fortunato, although in other regards he was a man to be respected and even feared. He prided himself on his expertise in wine. Few Italians have the true spirit. For the most part, their enthusiasm is adapted to suit the time and opportunity, to practice imposture upon the British and Australian millionaires. In painting and gemmery, Fortunato, like his countrymen, was a quack, but in the matter of old wines he was sincere. In this respect I did not differ from him materially. I was skillful in the Italian vintages myself, and bought largely wherever I could. It was about dusk one evening, during the supreme madness of the carnival season, that I encountered my friend. He accosted me with excessive warmth, for he had been drinking much. The man wore motley. He had a tight-fitting party-striped dress, and his head was surmounted by the conical caps and bells. I was so pleased to see him that I thought I should never have been done wringing his hand. I said to him, "How? My dear Fortunato, you are luckily met. How remarkably well you are looking today. But I have received a pipe of what passes for Amontillado. But I have my doubts." "How?" he said. "Amontillado, a pipe? Impossible. And in the middle of the carnival?" "I have my doubts," I replied, "and I was silly enough to pay the full Amontillado price without consulting you in the matter. You were not to be found, and I was fearful of losing a bargain. Amontillado? I have my doubts. Amontillado? I must satisfy them. Amontillado? As you are engaged, I am on my way. If anyone has a critical turn, it is he. He will tell me. Luchesi cannot tell Amontillado from sherry, and yet some fools will have it that his taste is a match of your own. Come, let us go. Whither? To your vaults. My friend, no. I will not impose upon your good nature. I perceive you have an engagement. I have no engagement. Come. My friend, no. It is not the engagement, but the severe cold with which I perceive you are afflicted. The vaults are damp. They are encrusted. Let us go, nevertheless. The cold is merely nothing. Amontillado, you have been imposed upon, and for Luchesi, he cannot distinguish sherry from Amontillado. Thus speaking, Fortunato possessed himself of my arm, putting on a mask of black silk and drawing closely about my person. I suffered him to hurry me to my palazzo. They had to make merry in honor of the time. I had told them that I should not return until the morning, and I had given them explicit written orders not to stir from the house. These orders were sufficient. I well knew to ensure their immediate disappearance, one and all, as soon as my back was turned. I took from the sconces 2 flames and gave one to Fortunato, bore him through several suites of rooms to the archway that led into the vaults. I passed down a long and winding staircase, requesting him to be cautious as he followed. He came at length to the foot of this descent, and stood together on the damp ground of the catacombs of the Montresors. The gait of my friend was unsteady, and the bells upon his cap jingled as he strode. "The pipe," said he. "It is further on. But observe the white webwork which gleams from these cavern walls." He turned toward me and looked into my eyes with 2 filmy orbs that distilled the ram of intoxication. "Nitre?" he asked at length. "Nitre," I replied. "How long have you had that cough?" "Ugh, ugh, ugh, ugh." My poor friend found it impossible to reply for many minutes. "It is nothing," he said at last. "Come," I said with decision. "We will go back. Your health is precious. You are rich, respected, admired. I am beloved. You are happy as once I was. You are a man to be missed. For me, it is no matter. We will go back. You will be ill, and I cannot be responsible. Besides, there is Luchesi." "Enough," he said. "The cough is a mere nothing. It will not kill me. I shall not die of a cough." "True, true," I replied, "and indeed I had no intention of alarming you unnecessarily, but you should use all proper precaution. A draught of this matok will defend us from the damps. Here, I knocked out the neck of a bottle which I drew from a long row of its fellows to lay upon the mold. Drink," I said, presenting him the wine. He raised it to his lips with a leer. He paused and nodded to me familiarly while his bells jingled. "I drink," he said, "to the buried that repose around us, and I to your long life." He again took my arm and we proceeded. "These vaults," he said, "are extensive." "The Montresors," I replied, "were a great and numerous family." "I forgot your arms." The wine sparkled in his eyes and the bells jingled. My own fancy grew warm with the matok. He had passed through the walls of piled bones. We had passed through the walls of piled bones with casks and puncheons intermingling into the remote recesses of the catacombs. I paused again, and this time I made bold to seize Fortunato by an arm above the elbow. "My nitre," I said. "See, it increases. It hangs like moss upon the vaults. We are below the river's bed. The drops of moisture trickle among the bones. Come, we will go back ere it is too late. Your cough." "It is nothing," he said. "Let us go on. But first, another draught of the matok." I broke and reached him a flacon of de Grave. He emptied it at a breath. His eyes flashed with a fierce light. He laughed and threw the bottle upwards with a gesticulation I did not understand. I looked at him in surprise. He repeated the movement, a grotesque one. "You do not comprehend?" he said. "Not I," I replied. "Then you are not of the Brotherhood." "How?" You are not of the Masons. Yes, yes, I said, yes, yes. You? Impossible, a Mason? A Mason, I replied. A sign, he said. It is this, I answered, producing a trowel from beneath the folds of my cloak. You jest, he exclaimed, recoiling a few paces, but let us proceed to the Amontillado. Be it so, I said, replacing the tool beneath the cloak and again offering him my arm. He leaned upon it heavily. We continued our route in search of the Amontillado. We passed through a range of low arches, descended, passed on, and descending again, arriving at a deep crypt, in which the foulness of the air caused our flames to rather to glow than flame. At the most remote end of the crypt there appeared another less spacious. Its walls had been lined with human remains, piled to the vault overhead. In the fashion of the great catacombs of Paris, 3 sides of this interior crypt were still ornamented in this manner. From the fourth the bones had been thrown down and lay promiscuously upon the earth, forming at one point a mound of some size. Within the wall thus exposed by the displacing of the bones, we perceived a still interior recess, in depth about 4 feet, in width 3, in height 6 or 7. It seemed to have been constructed for no especial use within itself, but formed merely the interval between 2 of the colossal supports of the roof of the catacombs, and was backed by one of the circumscribing walls of solid granite. It was in vain that Fortunato, uplifting his dull torch, endeavored to pry into the depths of the recess. Its termination the feeble light did not enable us to see. He is ignoramus, I interrupted my friend, as he stepped unsteadily forward while I followed immediately at his heels. In an instant he had reached the extremity of his niche, and finding his progress arrested by the rock, stood stupidly bewildered. A moment more and I had fettered him to the granite. In its surface were 2 iron staples, distant from each other, about 2 feet horizontally. From one of these depended a short chain. From the other a padlock. Throwing the links about his waist, it was about the work of a few seconds to secure it. He was too much astounded to resist. Withdrawing the key, I stepped back from the recess. Pass your hand, I said, over the wall. You cannot help feeling the nitre. Indeed, it is very damp. But once more let me implore you to return. No? Then I must positively leave you. But I must render you all the little attentions in my power. The Amontillado, The Amontillado, said my friend, not yet recovered from his astonishment. True, I replied, the Amontillado. As I said these words, I busied myself among the piles of bones of which I had before spoken. Throwing them aside, I soon uncovered a quantity of building stone and mortar. With these materials, and with the aid of my trowel, I began vigorously to wall up the entrance of this niche. I had scarcely laid the first tier of the masonry when I discovered that the intoxication of Fortunato had a great measure worn off. The earliest indication I had of this was a low moaning cry from the depths of the recess. It was not the cry of a drunken man. Then there was a long silence. I laid the second tier, and the third, and the fourth, and then I heard the furious vibrations of the chain. The noise lasted for several minutes, during which I might hearken to it with more satisfaction. I ceased my labors and sat down upon the bones. When at last the clanking subsided, I resumed the trowel and finished without interruption the 5th, the 6th, and the 7th tier. The wall was now nearly upon a level with my breast. I again paused, and holding the flame over my mason work, threw a few feeble rays upon the figure within. A succession of loud and shrill screams bursting suddenly from the throat of the chained form seemed to thrust me violently back. For a brief moment I hesitated, I trembled. I began to grope with it about the recess, but the thought of an instant reassured me. I placed my hand upon the solid fabric of the catacombs and felt satisfied. I reapproached the wall. I replied to the yells of him who clamored. I re-echoed, I aided, I surpassed them in volume and in strength. I did this, and the clamorer grew still. It was now midnight, and my task was drawing to a close. I had completed the 8th, the 9th, and the 10th tier. I had finished a portion of the last and the 11th. There remained but a single tier to be fit and plastered in. I struggled with its weight. I placed it partially in its destined position, but now there came from out the niche a low laugh that erected the hairs upon my head. It was succeeded by a sad voice, which I had difficulty in recognizing as that of the noble Fortunato. The voice said, "A very good joke indeed. An excellent jest. We'll have many a rich laugh about it at the palazzo. Over our wine." "The Amontillado," I said. "Yes, the Amontillado, but is it not getting late? Will they not be waiting us at the palazzo, the Lady Fortunato and the rest? Let us be gone." "Yes," I said, "let us be gone. For the love of God, Montressor." "Yes," I said, "for the love of God." But to these words I hearkened in vain for a reply. I grew impatient. I called aloud, "Fortunato." No answer. I called again, "Fortunato." No answer still. I thrust a torch and let it fall within. They came forth, in return only a jingling of the bells. My heart grew sick. It was the dampening of the catacombs that made it so. I hastened to make an end of my labor. I forced the last stone into its position. I plastered it up. Against the new masonry, I re-erected the old ramparts of bones. For the half of a century, no mortal has disturbed them. Yes, so that is all that I have for you today. The first story I told you was the Telltale Heart, and the second story I told you was the Cask of Amontillado. Amontillado, I don't know. So yeah, there was definitely times where I mispronounced some words in there. I also skipped certain words that I could still get the main story across, while skipping words that I definitely did not know. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this. This was a lot of fun. I liked kind of acting it out. I don't know, it was kind of fun for me. But if you did enjoy this and you want to see me kind of do some more stories like this, because I find this kind of thing really fun, please do let me know, and I will actually do more. So thank you for listening, watching, and doing all those things. Again, if you want to follow me on Twitter, it is @SashitHorror, and it's Instagram as well. I do have a Patreon account. You can go to my Twitter and find that if you want to. You don't have to do that. Again, you can get into my Discord. Ask me on Twitter. I will give you the Discord link. That is just so we can do kinds of like movie nights, community things like that. There's only one other person in there with me at the moment. I just made it not very long ago. But yes, please do like or rate me wherever you are listening to this podcast. And I do hope you greatly enjoy this podcast. And I hope you have a great rest of your day. And like I always say, remember, treat every day like it's Halloween.